respect everybody's time, and especially Elizabeth. So I am just going to introduce her, and then she will, Elizabeth, you're there, and you'll just pop in, and everybody else we can mute ourselves when she starts, and that'll ensure she has quietness until then. We'll open up for Q&A after her presentation, and she estimates her presentation will be about 30 minutes. So, okay. So Elizabeth, she grew up in California, in San Diego, and received a dual undergraduate degree in global studies and fine art from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She has a master's degree in fine art from Claremont Graduate University with an emphasis in painting. She also attended a residency program at the Banff Center in Canada to pursue installation art. Her current art practice combines 2D studio art and 3D installation art. And she works from a space in Georgetown, so South Seattle. In 2014, Elizabeth was selected and recognized in the Americans for the Arts 2014 Public Art Network Year in Review. And she has been awarded multiple fellowships, grants, public commissions, including an Artist Trust Gap grant from the City of Seattle. She has several projects that you can see in Seattle installations. And she also does solo exhibitions in Washington, Oregon, Oklahoma, and California, and even Barcelona, Spain. So she has global reach, which is very cool for a local artist here. And she has created public art installations throughout the Western states and been involved in group exhibits from Florida to Canada and in California. For everybody, if you haven't gone and looked at her website after the presentation, I encourage you to do that. Her website is elizabethgahan.com. So ElizabethGahan.com. Okay, I'm going to invite Elizabeth to start her presentation, and if everybody would go ahead and mute themselves until she's completed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. That was perfect. Thank you everyone for having me, and good morning. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to speak about today, you know, I was looking at my bio and kind of getting ready to outline my talk, and it got me thinking about sort of at what point did I start down the road that really developed into what it is I'm doing now. And I kind of wanted to talk about the evolution of the core themes of my art practice and my artwork. And so I think one of the ideas that's really this continuous thread from undergrad to now is this idea of how people build their surroundings. And unlike other animals, people so completely build their own habitats that we influence every aspect of our own lives. And so in this way, architecture and urban planning become almost a self-portrait of people. And then, of course, during undergrad, I was studying global studies, and basically that was a discipline that focused on the history of the world through the lens of cultural and economic exchange and interaction, which is now truer than ever. But you have to remember, at the time that I was sort of studying this, this was a new department. This was sort of a new theory of how to think about history and the impact of history on the present. But this had a huge impact on me, as it was a time where I was starting to think about what it was I wanted to talk about with my art. Up until then, it was more all about technical ability. And this was a time when I wanted to find my voice. What is it that I care about that's going to be meaningful to me and motivate me to make art for many, many years, potentially a career. Of course, artists can always shift their focus, but so far I'd really say the work I'm doing now is a continuation of those initial interests and inquiries. And so another thing that really impacted, I think, my path was that while of course I wanted to develop my own aesthetic and my own style, I also started to see myself as something of a modern day history painter and trying to capture this present day, but in real time. And so I'm gonna try to share my screen now, so hopefully this works. Yeah, so right from the beginning, I started looking at history painters, especially the Hudson River School, and how their style is gorgeous and grandiose and also daunting, and just really telling of that particular moment of expansion and exploration. Everything from the scale, the colors, the brushwork is so reflective of that moment, and this notion of the sublime, which I was also really captivated with. And so these are kind of the tenets that I started to bring into my own practice to develop my own visual language. And then to just juxtapose that with one of my own paintings. So with my painting, I wanted to capture this moment that we're in terms of the subject matter, in terms of the color, the style and the mood of the paintings. This is a time of rapid urban development, rapid, human population growth, technology, digital tools, social media influence. The colors we see every day are enhanced both digitally in terms of television and photography and social media, but also even in real life. Technology for textiles and advertising, all the colors are so hyper real and saturated. And there's so much sensory information. It's very abundant, just being constantly inundated with new information and new visual information as well. And things are changing faster than ever, and the surroundings are very fluid. So these are all things that I'm starting to think about as I'm developing my work and capturing this sense of saturation and fluidity and kind of this overlapping of the urban and the natural and what that means. And so at this point, this image is older. This is from when I'm in graduate school at Claremont Graduate University, which is in LA. And so really at that time, I start focusing on this relationship between architecture and advertising, because that was such a big influence of that urban landscape. And LA is also, next door neighbors to Las Vegas, and I had spent a little bit of time there. Someone I knew was living there. And Las Vegas and LA sort of have a lot in common in terms of how they're using the space as almost this marketing canvas. And so I really started thinking about how advertising was literally impacting the construction of architecture, and how that was having just as big an impact as any kind of sort of intentional urban planning. And so sometimes it felt almost like instead of trees, there were billboards. And also at this time, I'm thinking more broadly about how the built environment shapes our perspective on what we value, how we value space, how we define beauty. This is a Las Vegas image. You can see it's just inundated with billboards. Yeah, and when we're exposed to this concept of beauty, how does that impact other forms of beauty, like how we perceive and value nature and how we perceive and value other forms of beauty? And so my imagery is very colorful and seductive, but there's also this sort of critical questioning of, is this a healthy landscape? Is this beautiful landscape? Is there sort of maybe some undertow of caution? It's almost too hyper real, too exaggerated. And in this image, I don't know if I can zoom in, but a lot of the color is actually coming from advertising itself, which I have cut and embedded into the image and actually becomes the architecture. And I did a whole series that was sort of half painting, half collage in this way. And then here there's sort of this, that orange is almost three-dimensional gel application. You're sort of looking through this veil of something kind of amoebic and undescribed at this kind of billboard landscape. So this is sort of earlier work, and I'm starting to kind of explore these ideas on how we shape our space, and then how in turn that space shapes the way we see the world. So then, from there, I'm heading into let's see, I'm in grad school. I'm heading to the Banff Center in Canada, where I'm around a very global community of artists. And from there, I'm moving to Seattle and sort of trying to take in new influences and allow my work to grow and sort of evolve from, you want to go from school and really sort of hit your stride. And so I start revisiting this idea of global phenomena, and I begin to use imagery from my own travels and my own personal experience. And sometimes it's recognizable imagery that's sort of iconic. People will be able to place that location, no problem. And then other times I'm using more ambiguous imagery so that you see it and you recognize it as familiar, but it could really be anywhere. It could be a place that you, the viewer, have been before. You can attribute your own experiences and memories to that imagery. And it becomes more important and central in my work that the imagery of these paintings are based on photos I've taken and experiences that I've had. When I'm in a place and I see all the elements I look for in a painting, all of a sudden I just have a flash in my head where I can envision that scene as a painting. And so I really, in an instant, already kind of have this sense of the color scheme, and I really want the colors to kind of create the mood for the painting, so that it's based more on the character and the feeling of the place than just a realistic likeness of the place. And then when I go to paint these images, I begin with the background, and I have the city imagery in mind, but the idea of the colors is really more of an intuitive thing. And I'm using these really watered down paint applications so that it sort of diminishes my control a little bit. And it's sort of the only part of my painting process that's really just intuitive, where I'm pouring paint and pouring water and kind of lifting and moving the canvas. And it's a little bit, I'm controlling some elements, but it's a little bit out of my hands. And I want that aspect of spontaneity, because everything in my process after that is so planned and it's has so much strategy. It's like a puzzle trying to work out just what the right next step is all the way until completion. And a lot of my process is very meticulous and specific. So having that counterbalance of something that's very intuitive and fluid, it both speaks to this idea of this moment being very fluid, but it also is a way for me to kind of balance what is very sort of planned and meticulous and what is, sort of more free form, and this juxtaposition between that. And at this time, I'm sort of picking imagery that's from all over the world. So each image is a vignette of a specific place, but when I do a show, it's sort of this collection from all over the world, speaking to this sense of global community. This idea that while each city has unique characteristics, on the whole, cities around the world and neighborhoods around the world share quite a lot. The way we build space is very similar despite these kind of social cultural differences. And so this one is actually, I'll say, Costa Rica. This is Rome. I was fortunate at the time to be traveling a lot. So now at this point, I've been living in Seattle for several years, and I really start to focus more on what are the influences of this part of the country. How is this impacting my painting style? How is this impacting things I see every day, really wanting to embrace that? And so I start really thinking a lot more about the specific relationship between the built environment and nature. And I'm still asking a lot of questions about how we value space, how we as a people define beauty, how sort of urban development and urban planning impact how people interact with one another, how virtual spaces impact how people interact with one another. And really still in the forefront of my mind is this idea of capturing a sense of this moment in time. Like how does this shape who we are as people? But I'm also really trying to see it through the lens of local influences. And one of the things that I love about Seattle and I love about the Northwest is this integration of nature and built environment. And it's actually, and you know, going from LA where it was very much advertising and there was, you know, something bothersome about that in the landscape, moving to the Northwest, I felt very optimistic about the landscape, where it felt like a lot of times nature and the built environment could exist hand in hand, not in such an adversarial way. So I really wanted to bring that optimism into my work. And so I think there's a big transition you see visually here from the early sort of LA, Las Vegas, where it's a bit more stark. And then here it's very full, very active, but still that sense of bubbles and fluidity and, you know, and constant shifting and movement. And I'm also doing these like line drawings, and I'm displaying the architecture with transparency. So you're sort of seeing through it. And it's this idea that it's not fully formed. It could be coming into being, or it could be devolving as well. And so thinking about urban environments more like natural environments, these niches, these ecosystems where, you know, to have a healthy ecosystem, you need sort of this balance of art and culture and nature. And so I'm trying to embrace that in the imagery, this balance between, you know, nature kind of being transparent, but then all the way to opaque, to really three-dimensional gel applications. And this idea that the built environment in nature, it's really, you know, where does one begin and one end? Really, they overlap so much, and sometimes that's in a conflicting way, sometimes that's in a symbiotic way, but really, you know, we as people kind of impact everything about our surroundings and our environment. So where is that line? So I'm really trying to use these saturated colors and painting techniques throughout, and showing that, sorry, I'm gonna let a few more people in the waiting room here. But I'm really trying to show that nature and the built environment are almost like extensions of one another, and kind of treating nature and the buildings in sort of similar ways. So this is, you're kind of seeing, I'm showing you pictures as I talk that are, all of this is imagery from the area. You just saw Deception Point. This is the Volunteer Park Conservatory. And again, you can see I'm very attracted to beautiful architecture, but also, especially at this point in time, all the imagery has this presence of nature. And then you can see, but the nature is also sort of hyper real and stylized, and not entirely natural. And that becomes, has become also a very important theme in all of my work, this idea of what is natural, what is unnatural, blurring the line between the two, and kind of looking at our human footprint in our environment. And this is Freeway Park, and it's actually called Freeway, the title's Freeway Park, but this park by the convention center in downtown is also called Freeway Park. And I just love that because in the name it shows just this overlapping, right? Freeway and park together. That seems very unusual, and yet it is so clearly descriptive of this landscape. And I'm very attracted to architecture, and I'm very attracted to nature, and they often seem at odds. And so a lot of times in my paintings, it's thinking about how those things coexist. And then also I'll note that, you know, I primarily use acrylic paint, and in sort of that, what appears on the screen is sort of these thick, shiny areas. Those are kind of blobby paint applications. I use a palette knife, and, you know, it allows the nature to sort of be not just opaque, but thicker and more dominant, but it also gives it this plasticky, hyper real feel. And again, that's this idea that nature in built environments isn't entirely natural in and of itself, right? It's been planted there, or groomed, or left there and allowed to be there, and it interacts with the buildings in a certain way that that sets it apart from sort of an unaltered wilderness, right? So I'm thinking about all of these things. And so really at this point in my career, I think another theme that has emerged is this intention of sort of doing work that strives to balance the beauty and inspiration of the built environment and what we as people create, but also wanting to continue to ask critical questions and have sort of this consideration of how you know, our growing urban environments are impacting our surroundings. Let's see. And then amidst all of this, several years back, I started this sort of tangent that's very much a part of my body of work. I show it hand in hand with the canvas paintings, but I was also taking photos of houses. Again, I'm just fascinated with architecture and urban planning, and I've been taking photos of houses for so long, and I really wanted to paint them and portray them, but it felt like I had to do it in a slightly different way than the way I portray the urban landscapes. And then I finally had this aha moment of using wood panels and the line drawings in these paintings. It might be hard to tell on the computer, but they're not just drawn on. I'm actually using wood burning, and I'm burning that into the panel. And wood burning is sort of more traditionally a craft, and there's something about a home that's sort of a personal private space. And this is another theme that starts coming up in my work, of this juxtaposition between public space and personal space. So when we're in the city, it's public space, but we're having a personal private experience of that space. And then I'm looking at private homes, which is a private space, and yet private homes really create this visual landscape that we all live in and enjoy, especially here in the Northwest. The neighborhoods are so beautiful. So I thought by bringing in this element of craft, it really speaks to this sort of more personalized, handcrafted idea of what a home is. And then, of course, I'm still bringing into that these saturated colors, the acrylic gel medium, and sort of my treatment of the urban landscapes, because these homes still exist in this contemporary time and in these urban environments, but there's something about them that I wanted to make a little bit more personal. And I sort of used the process of wood burning and sort of the feeling of the wood panel, hopefully, to bring that into the visual language. And so these are all homes, you know, throughout this region. And again, I'm still hoping that color both is a nod to this contemporary moment of sort of hyper reality saturation of color, but I also hope that those colors, you know, I'll just back it up, also feel very Northwest to me, and these teals and these greens. It's not that you don't find it elsewhere, but I am hoping that just sort of through my personal experience of the space, that aesthetic of this local aesthetic is coming through. So I thought I'd speak to that a little bit. And then where I'm kind of going now in my last show, solo show in Seattle at Linda Hodges Gallery, in addition to doing these urban landscapes, which really has been the format that I've used, where I'm kind of looking out at these broad landscapes, I started doing these interior spaces. I started becoming especially interested in conservatories and how conservatories are both have architecture and nature, but even more than that, the nature inside these conservatories are in a way very unnatural. They're of course plants, and so they're nature, but it's plants from all over the world that wouldn't otherwise be living in this location. And so this idea of how it's curated and choreographed started making me think about how I think about buildings and architecture, and also painting imagery with more nature is really fun and beautiful. And so now I'm kind of going on this tangent where this is where I want my work to continue to go at this moment of exploring this idea of curated nature and being able to really enjoy the process of painting these scenes of plants where I get to use all the techniques I've developed over the years, this visual language that's become sort of unique to my painting that's very colorful. I'm mixing, you know, these thin transitions of color that are very transparent and delicate with this line drawing where I'm using rulers and pens, and it's very specific and meticulous, and this nod to sort of architectural schematics, and I'm using actually oil-based paint pens to do that. And then I also started using these oil-based almost like enamel paints, and pouring them onto my canvas and manipulating them to get additional sort of marbleizing colors for the leaves.
Sorry, Elizabeth,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering with the background, if the background noise, is it you?
No, it's not. It's not by me. I'm in a
Somebody
empty room.
to mute themselves, please. Everybody mute yourselves. We're getting background noise that you have to talk over.
We're getting music now.
You can mute everybody from your end, I think, Elizabeth.
All right, let me see if I can figure out how to do that.
Okay. Okay, they turned it off. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. I just wanted
No, that's fine. I'm actually, and are you still seeing my screen of my painting images?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right.
Do you design your painting before you start working on it?
Yes, I do. So when I am in a place and I sort of, and this happens to me all the time, I have thousands and thousands of photos where I'm in the real world and I'm seeing a scene thinking that would be a gorgeous painting. I want to do that someday. And so I'm collecting all these photos. And then as I start to kind of hone in on which ones I'm going to work on, because my painting process is very time consuming. It takes a long time. I only work on between like 1 and 4 or 5 paintings at a time. And, you know, a show of 20 paintings is quite a lot of work for me. So, as soon as I hone in on the paintings I want, and I'm sort of thinking, usually I have a show in mind, so I kind of know, okay, am I going to focus on Seattle, Northwest imagery? Am I going to focus on other areas in the world? And I start selecting my photos, and I put them in the computer, and I create a line drawing using Illustrator. And I think that using digital technology is a really important part of my process, because I hope by using digital technology, the slickness that comes from using that technology also influences the imagery. So you're getting this hybrid of something that's very painterly, but also has this sort of influence of digital technology. And so while I'm working on the line drawing on the computer, I'm usually starting on the canvas. So I do have a pretty good idea in my mind of the placement of things, like what the view will be, what the perspective will be, but I am very careful not to have that imagery in front of me when I'm painting the backgrounds. And so I kind of go to my studio, lock myself in, have a table full of sort of watered down paints. And in the early days, I used watercolor for the background until I discovered liquid acrylic. And so I'm really trying to use liquid acrylic like watercolor. And so I'm trying to let that imagery that I know I want to do and that memory of the place influence the colors I pick. But I'm also trying really hard to not think so specifically about the imagery. So a lot of times I'll paint the canvas and then I'll photograph the background, put it in the computer, and then I'll actually use Photoshop or Illustrator to superimpose the architectural imagery on top of the background, and I'll flip the background upside down and I'll figure out what orientation makes the most sense. Sometimes I'll make the architectural imagery larger or smaller so that where the focus point in the imagery kind of hits the background in a nice sweet spot. So there is a little bit of this idea of doing those two things independently, but then coming back and marrying them together. And then when I have this background, that really ends up dictating every decision I make after that. So I just superimpose the architectural imagery on top of that and do the entire line drawing. And then I have sort of the bare bones of my image. And then I begin to build it up so that the colors I'm choosing in the foreground are a reaction to the colors in the background. And every time I start adding transparency here, that nudges me to add thickness and opacity in other areas. And so it's this dance back and forth. And it's also this decision of how much of the background remains and shows through and how much of the foreground sort of overtakes it, and striking that balance between what is unfinished and what is finished. And it's also a tricky process because as soon as I make the decision to paint on top of the background, I can never get that back. So every decision is sort of permanent. You know, I can always paint over it and make it more opaque or put thick paint over it, but I can never get the background back. So I always have to think very carefully about what areas in the background seem very important to me or very beautiful to me that I want to preserve. And especially towards the end of the painting, every decision seems like this big deal because, of course, I don't want to ruin that balance right at the end of the process, but also because there have been so many decisions made getting to that point that it almost feels like there are very few moves left. It's really like a game of Tetris when you get to the very end, and it's like only a few pieces will still fit in what already exists. And that's kind of, that really speaks to my process and how I think about painting. And people often ask, like, is there actually an end point? And for me, there really is this moment where I feel like it's done. I've reached that balance. And if I go one step further, I'll have gone too far. And there's a lot of times where I'll sit in front of a painting for hours thinking there's one thing missing. It doesn't feel done yet, because I'm really trying to strike a balance between that sense of unfinishedness, and yet I want the painting to overall have this sense of completion and harmony. So, you know, it might all be in my own head, but I really do feel like with each piece, I know it's done when I feel like it has that balance. So great question. And actually, this is a great time to kind of ebb into questions. I have a sort of a few more images. Oh yeah, and I, for the first time, started doing these florals. Before, I never really thought to do florals or still lifes. I thought they were beautiful, but they just didn't apply to my work. And then I started thinking about Pike's Market and all these gorgeous flowers, and started thinking, well, this is very, you know, these florals seem very kind of tied into the region and sort of my experience and what I love about this place, you know, and Pike's Market being an example of one of the things I love about how the neighborhoods in the Northwest have so much character. And that's true of all the neighborhoods. And I loved Pike's Market when I first moved here, and I love it to this day. And so, you know, it's something that sort of transcends local versus visiting and international. And so I started doing flowers. And so I love that living in this place has taken me down that road. And then I will sort of point out one more tangent. I also had a show in at George Billis Gallery in LA earlier this year, just in February, right before everything started to get really weird. And so, yeah, so it's actually my art opening when I was in LA. I kind of reference that as sort of the last normal moment I can remember before, yeah, things got real weird. And so I just wanted to share this too, because when I did the show in LA, I went about a year ago. And of course, I lived in LA for a few years, and I grew up in Southern California. So it was interesting to me because this show is all about how that space is very familiar to me and very personal to me, but now I've been living in Seattle for over 12 years, so it also feels foreign to me. So it was kind of, I'm an insider and an outsider all at the same time. So I went down to LA and just revisited all of the neighborhoods from my memories and was taking photos and really trying to capture sort of these quintessential LA moments. So this 1970s architecture that in real life is really kind of bland, but it's been reinvented with this cool cafe and this cool tattoo. And you know, this is in Venice Beach area, which is very quirky. And I'm using colors, you know, it's, the colors are so saturated and vibrant. It almost has this like 80s feel to it. For some reason, that's how I felt when I was taking that photo. And then I was downtown and looking at this sort of like beautiful 1920s architecture, which when you're in LA, you almost don't even see this beautiful architecture downtown because you're so inundated with everything else that is downtown LA. So I really started honing in on, you know, this weird juxtaposition of like this beautiful 1920s, you know, Art Deco style building that's this historic hotel next to this more contemporary skyscraper with all the palm trees in the foreground. It just seemed very quintessential LA to me. This is the canals in Venice Beach, which I feel like is very iconic to LA. And there's already a beauty in it, but a strangeness in it. And so I just tried to use the color, and I took, you know, 100 photos of the canals, but this one really stood out to me because you've got the swan boat and the flamingo boat, and they're kind of neighbors. And there's, I don't know, this humor to it that also feels very LA to me. So you can see how I'm trying to use color and imagery and sort of what images of a place I'm picking that kind of really feel true to the place. Both, you know, the imagery is real. This is really the buildings that are there. And even some of the colors of the buildings are true to the buildings that exist. But I'm also taking a lot of liberties to kind of play that up and make it feel the way I feel when I'm there. And, you know, and the woman who bought this painting, she just said to me, she was like, I know exactly this spot, and there's something about it that is so true to standing right on that spot. And I just loved that without my telling her that that's one of my aims when I paint. She kind of just, you know, felt it for herself and expressed that to me. And I thought, okay, I've done my job. You know, I've done this one well. I've managed to capture that and share that. And then I did wood burning pieces that were specifically about the homes in LA and sort of some of the architecture that pops up there over and over again. And it's not that you can't see this architecture elsewhere, but the way I actually showed this, I did 9 sort of mid-sized pieces, and I showed them together in a grid because individually they're these unique houses, but together it creates sort of a neighborhood. And that to me is also very LA, how in one neighborhood you get this like smattering of different architectural styles, sort of the Spanish influence, and this, you know, there's even craftsman style influence, and but they all kind of coexist on the same
like
block.
this, another one like this.
So, yep, that's the last image I have to share with you, and I will attempt to switch back to, I'm not sure how to show myself again. Let's see. No.
We can see it ourselves.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you get I understand how you do with the Illustrator, the drawing over the photograph. How do you get it from the computer onto it? Are these all on a canvas? How do you get it? Do you print it onto the canvas, or do you trace it from?
Very good question. Yeah.
How do you get it from the computer to the
actual physical space? My process on that has evolved. Early on, I would use projectors. And so I would do the architecture on the computer. I'd print it on a transparency. I'd project it.
I'm sorry, you'd print it on a what? Oh,
a transparency. Yeah. And then I'd project it onto the canvas. So actually a lot of my paintings are actually canvas.
You have to draw on you have the projection, but then you have to draw
exactly
on top of that.
And a lot of my canvases are over panels so that I have a rigid surface, because then I'm using rulers and pens.
So
and so I tell people
there, and then you're like using, you're going and drawing like
Let her finish.
on the projection. Okay.
And so I'm essentially drawing the image 3 times. So I take the photo, I draw it on the computer in Illustrator, where I'm just boiling it down to the lines and kind of
I understand that part.
Yeah, and it really makes it more of a uniform space, because of course I'm sort of unintentionally correcting like crooked lines and making it, and that's where the digital technology kind of visually influences the imagery. And then, so I used to use projection. Now I actually just use graphic transfer paper. And so I will print that line drawing
Of the
on
graphic
paper, just thin Xerox paper. Either there's a company I go to that does wide format printing, so I can print up to 3 feet wide, or I'll use a tile printing feature in Illustrator and piece it together. And then I'll use the transfer paper with rulers and, you know, and pens. But essentially, so I draw it on the computer, then I draw it in pencil on the canvas. That way I can change things if I want to. And then I draw it again using the paint pens. And so I essentially draw it 3 times before.
Okay.
And then to me, that's when the painting really begins. I've got my background, I've got my drawing, and now I'm beginning. So, and then I paint back into the imagery. So yeah, that's a really important step in the process. And yeah.
I have 2 questions. One of them, are you an architect?
I get that question all the time, and
Because
I'm an architect or an urban planner.
Because you're building a perfect perspective. I was an architect 2 years, and I know what's perspective is a perfect.
Thank
Look
you.
like a camera, you know.
I love when the architects in the crowd come forward, because it also makes me feel like I'm doing something right. It's just my love and my study of architecture for so many years coming through. And actually, I thought early on, before deciding, you know what, I'm just going to go for it and be an artist, I thought a lot about going into architecture, but I wasn't so sure that I was going to like all the math, you know, which is really funny to me now, because so painting is just one aspect of my studio practice. I also do installation art and public art and sculpture, and I use math and geometry all the time. I'm constantly, you know, refreshing my high school geometry algorithms and, you know, and all this stuff.
Yeah. Great, really great. I really enjoy it very much. The second question I have is, do you complete your painting with color on a computer before you transfer it to the canvas?
No, absolutely not. The only thing I'm doing on the computer is the line drawing. So it's strictly black and white. And then especially the only time I'm really kind of seeing it with color is when, like I said, I'll take a photo of the background, the watercolor background once I'm done, and I'll use Illustrator to put that on a layer and put the architecture over the top, so I can kind of get a sense of which way I want to orient the canvas. And also if I want to tweak the architecture a little bit so that, oh, let me go back. There's one image in particular where this is really well illustrated. Sorry, I'm scrolling back through. So in this one, I really wanted the spire of this Gothic cathedral in the background to hit that circle. It almost feels like a halo behind it. And so I played with the scale of the imagery a lot to get it to hit in the right places. So, but otherwise, I really don't see the architectural imagery, the line drawings, and the color together initially. And then of course, because I'm using the transfer paper and I'm putting this white paper with the line drawing over the top, the entire time I'm tracing the building, I'm also not seeing the background as I'm tracing it. I'm kind of relying on the decisions I made on the computer and then just kind of going for it. And once I start drawing the buildings, there's no going back. And so then once I remove the paper and make sure I've got all the drawings, I'm adding the color for the first time. And then as I paint into it, I'm making all those color decisions as I go.
Okay, I understand them. It's great, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Because architecture, you're really good at it. Because I studied 2 years in architect. I'm an engineer too at the same time. I can relate to geometric shape really, really well, you know.
Thank you. I really kind of do wish I had more of a formal training in architecture and engineering, and I wish I had time to do it all.
You have a great perspective of it, you know, really you do. With lines and building, you know, because every painting you have a building there, you know, and the building well put together, perspective wise.
I think I'll go back to scrolling back through this one.
Yeah.
This one I think is just very representative of my work now. It's sort of, the top is very dominated by the buildings, but again, they're all kind of translucent and they're kind of emerging. And then down below, you get sort of the freeways intersecting with the landscape, but also the bottom half is predominantly sort of nature imagery, the way I do nature imagery, which is very super colorful. And with this one, that was also really fun to paint because I was using all this gel medium. I used this very thick gel medium. It goes on like frosting. And
the only thing missing in the painting is a human.
Yes, and that's another thing people ask me about all the time. Why don't you paint
Because you
people?
don't know the perspective of the building to a human. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's true. For scale, it would be nice. I try and there are some paintings where I'll put like garbage cans and cars and tables to kind of get that. But I'm really reluctant to show people because as soon as we see the image of a person, we then start to relate to that person on an individual level. Like, who are they? What's their gender? Where are they from? What do they look like? And I really want to, yeah, and I really want to talk about people on the whole and create this space where it's, I'm trying to bring the viewer into it. You are the person in the painting, essentially. And the buildings represent people. It's sort of this portrait of people, but I'm very reluctant to put actual people in it because I think it inevitably changes the focus of the conversation and takes it down a road that really isn't my goal. And my hope is too that the person looking at the painting, you are the person in the painting, and hopefully you're bringing your own experiences of similar environments, and maybe it reminds you of a place you've been or an experience that you've had. So I don't want to get in the way of that kind of personal connection either.
Thank you.
I have a question I want to ask Elizabeth about, you talked about your visual language. And you have what you call bubbles, which to me feel like energy. It feels like the cosmos is sort of overlaid with the, it's the macro and the micro. So it feels like a cell, it feels like a planet. And that's sort of this subtle energy you're bringing to things not being this or that, but them all coexisting. So the macro with the micro, the abstract with the linear, and how wonderful that you've managed to make that all work together, and it all reads really well. It's great. It's got the harmony you talk about, but it's, with it would be totally different if it didn't have those bubbles of color, that abstract intuitive thing that actually, by letting the intuitive come through, you're letting even a larger message come through, which is so interesting. I do a lot of symbol, and that's what I feel is present here also, as well as the very linear and logic minded.
You put that so beautifully. I'm really glad I'm recording this because that is, everything you said is absolutely correct. And if that comes through in my painting, again, I feel like I've really done what I set out to do. It is very much about this macro and micro. I often will refer to these bubbles as sort of gaseous, or and so it is almost like it could be referencing the biology of the atmosphere, so sort of this microscopic, or it could be this cosmos. And I think that kind of micro and macro is very important. What's that?
And the other thing that strikes me about that is we live in these times, in which everybody is so divisive. I'm this or I'm that. And you're creating these canvases in which it all harmonizes together. And it just reminds me of the importance of art to remind us that we're not this or that. We're in this one universe, whatever little corner you're highlighting, but that it all can work together.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to, we don't have to be this or that. We can be together. We can be harmonious.
Absolutely. And that really reaches back to my studies in global studies, where it really formed my opinion of the world, and really reminds me that we have so much more in common than not. And I do think that art and architecture is hopefully a space where we can feel that and see that and look to that. And it's interesting that you would bring that up, because before I got my master's in fine art, I also looked into master's in global studies. But what I found is that a lot of the programs for international relations and such were much more at that time economic based. And I was much more interested in cultural exchange as a way of crossing that borders and boundaries and seeing sort of commonalities and being a vehicle to share and exchange. And so I decided, you know what, I will do art, and I will use the art to circle back around to this idea of how art can be this vehicle for sharing and connecting. And so that really was a pivotal moment at the beginning of my career, where I really did want to create art that was about that. And hopefully, and this is where, you know, not only do I do the painting, but I do public art and public installation art, where what I love about the public art is you're kind of going into the world and really trying to build installations that impact a space, that create a space where people in their everyday lives just happen upon this artwork, and hopefully creates this shared experience that anyone kind of going through that space. And that's one of the reasons why I love temporary art too, because it's only there for a certain amount of time. And then there's one piece I did, and it's on my website. It was in Westlake Park in downtown Seattle, and it was on the arch in Westlake Park. It's this very urban kind of plaza park. And I did this very colorful piece. And even now and this was in 2013, I believe, and even now when I have open studios under normal conditions, I have people who come in and see a photo of that and say, I remember that piece, I saw that piece. And to just, to know that it made such an impact, but also to see how all these different people over this period of time have that shared experience now, where they remember that piece, but then they also had a personal experience with it. You know, everybody's reaction was their own. And this relationship between public space and private experience is also so important, both in the paintings and the ways that you described, and then also in the installation art, where in the paintings, I'm talking about that and I'm trying to represent that. And then in the installation art, I'm trying to create it. I'm trying to create a moment in which art can facilitate that and help that happen for people. So that's why, and a lot of times people will say my paintings and my installation art are so different. And I think at first glance, they do look different, and yet they all stem from the same ideas and interests. And so for me, they're really complementary and sort of extensions of one another.
What the average size, what the average,
yeah, I definitely get the feeling of the personal being the collective. Your art and what you're showing. The organic being the organic and the linear too.
Yeah.
And also, and then, like, even when you have something like an art installation that is temporary, you know, the fact that that's still on a resonance kind of energetic basis still stays with people, still stays with this space, even when it's gone. And I find that so interesting.
Thank you.
You know, and people just remember that when they see a picture.
Yeah. And someone had a question about scale, I think.
I have a quick question.
Oh, sure.
With a recording, do we go to you to get the recording?
We may not do, Kathy. If there's a recording link, we'll send it out as a group.
Yeah.
We don't go to her.
Okay,
she hasn't decided. We don't usually...
I missed the meeting last month, and it was recorded. How do I get a copy?
Okay, we'll go. That's like, let her finish her presentation.
Okay, but I have that question.
You can just email the your questions. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, what's the size of your painting, the average size?
So the wood burning pieces tend to be smaller, more intimate. And then I also started doing this boom series, which I didn't talk about today, but it's on my website, which are smaller, so that the imagery, rather than being these grand views, it's more like these dense snapshots. And so those I do smaller, but canvas wise, my paintings will go as big. So from small, usually for a canvas piece that's like an urban landscape like this, I really tend to shy away from anything smaller than 24 inches, 18 by 24 inches or 24 inches by 24 inches, but then they can scale up to as big as 12 feet. I did a private commission a few years back that was, I believe, 9 feet by 12 feet. and it was of the Des Moines Marina. And what I loved about that is when you're standing in front of it, it's like, you know, the scale of it, it's almost like you're in the landscape. And so I actually, yeah, I prefer to work bigger and kind of get that sense of like, you are there, right? It's taking up your whole view when you stand in front of it, and the colors are really impacting you physically and visually.
How long did you get to finish it?
That one I worked on for many months.
A year.
And you know, and also when you work on a piece that large, there's a lot more anxiety about messing up, right? Especially at the end where you're like, okay, after everything I've put into this, I don't want to put the last blob in the wrong spot. So, but it came out beautifully. And I do prefer to work bigger, but of course it's harder to sell bigger paintings. And so I have to kind of temper myself a bit. So I usually hit between, like, the majority of my paintings that hit that sweet spot for me where it feels big enough to express myself, but still accessible to the view, to the public, is sort of 30 by 40 inches, or in the 36 range, 36-inch range. I prefer the 48-inch range, but that seems to be, you know, large for a lot of people, for their homes.
It is a big for a home. It is big. Like my average one between 30 and 24. That's my
yeah. Yeah, that seems to be where people really feel comfortable when they're thinking about buying a painting, like what'll fit in their space.
We don't have a big houses. We don't have a big houses to have a big piece like that, you know.
Yeah. I wish I had a big house so that I could hang a big piece. I personally like to go for the 24, 36 inches too.
I have a reasonable house. I have a 72 painting on the wall, 72 painting.
That would be lovely.
No space to put anything anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
Also for everybody that if you have a question and you'd rather not say it out loud, you can put your question in the chat box. And Elizabeth could look it up that way. If anybody, you know, would rather not go, you know, would rather input it, type it in versus having to say it. So that's available too, just to let you all know.
Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I learned a lot about architect painting, you know.
Thank you. Oh, good. I finally figured out how to stop sharing. So yes, if people have messages, then I can look at it here.
I couldn't get my picture in. I need to figure out how to do that.
So
now,
yeah.
Is all your available work, is it on your website if it's available, or do you have like an updated place where it's available?
You know, that's a good question. My website is more a portfolio of my work. So it's more set up to kind of just show people the bodies of work. But I do have work at the Seattle Art Museum Gallery, and they have a profile page for me of available work. I have work at Linda Hodges Gallery, and they have a profile page for me and of available work. And then I also at the LA Gallery is George Billis Gallery, and they have a page that has work of mine. So, and then I also have a profile page on a site called Wes-Cover. And it's just how it sounds, WES Cover. And on there, that's really the only place where almost everything I've posted is either available paintings or past installation art. And that one actually even has prices. I usually don't publish prices, but that forum is a bit more commercial. And especially, you know, with COVID trying to be more present online, I decided to do that profile on Wes-Cover, and I like their format, and I like the other artists, and they show architecture and interior design, and I like that space where all of those things are shown together, because I also like that kind of overlapping of art, architecture, design. So I like that site a lot, and I've tried to kind of have a presence there, and also kind of hopefully increase my presence online. So those are the places that you could go to see more available work. But yeah, my personal website is more like a portfolio of my work, and there's a lot of information, especially the installation art. I might have a brief description of sort of each piece, what I was thinking about. It's much more try and have a conversation with the public than about specifically available work, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, that's great. And Anna Choi had a question. She said, did you do the Bellevue Museum sign?
Yes, I did. Yes. The BAM.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I did do that one. I've done a fair bit of work in Bellevue. I love working in Bellevue, and several years back, I did for the Bellevue Art Fair. I did the feature piece, and it was actually this tunnel that you could walk through that had 3D colorful crystals, and then these kind of portholes you could look out and people could look in, and there was it created a lot of interaction with the artwork and between people and selfies, and then as a sister piece to that, I did the BAM letters. I had never done letters before, but I just tried to imbue it with that so all of my installation art is sort of this inspired by forms in nature and architecture. So I'm thinking a lot about geometry, and I'm thinking about geometry in nature, like crystals and honeycombs and spirals and shells. And so, yeah, I did the BAM letters. It was kind of a departure for me. I worked with them on that. They were interested, and I went for it. And I just love how it turned out. And they use it now all the time, which is fantastic.
I moved from Southern California too. It's been just 2 years since I've been here.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to Bellevue Museum. It's like first Friday of the month is free.
Yes.
And so then I went and I saw that and I went, wow. And then now when you came online, I thought, I recognize that sign. Maybe she did it. So
yes,
yeah,
I did that. And you can see, and that kind of speaks to what I was saying before about how my installation art and my painting might seem different, but then at the same time, there's so much in common in terms of how I'm thinking about public space and how I'm thinking about nature and architecture. And the corrugated plastic to me is very much this synthetic material, very man-made, but then a lot of the installations are influenced by forms in nature. So I'm kind of mashing up and marrying those two things. And then the color is very much spoofing off of both advertising, but also you see that kind of vibrant color in nature. And I'm, employing this concept of crystals. And it's also this idea that these things could kind of grow and multiply on their own. So we kind of produce these materials and we create these built environments, and they kind of take on a life of their own and multiply, and almost like a living organism, right? Like our cities almost become like this habitat. And so a lot of my installations is this idea of repetition of forms and this reference to nature, almost as if the plastic and the vinyl are living organisms kind of infiltrating this space. And so I actually currently have an installation up in Burien at Dottie Harper Park for the Burien Arts Aglow. And usually it's a one-day festival with lights, but because they couldn't do this year, they just had 1 month where a few artists did installations in the park and people could kind of come and go. And those are flowers made from political yard signs that I've repurposed after elections. And I kind of cut them up and create flowers or different forms inspired by nature, and I obscure the content by spray painting pattern until these pieces almost feel organic, even though they are totally not, right? They're totally synthetic. And then I place them in the environment in almost this symbiotic way, kind of this coexistence again of like, how can we coexist? I'm not saying we get rid of one for the other, but like, how do we think about how those things relate to one another and exist in the same space? So, yeah.
great.
Thank you for recognizing my work.
Yes.
And I would also note, bringing up again the question of, being from Southern California, I think, when I moved here over 12 years ago, my aesthetic of this like super colorful and kind of hyper real was not so usual here. I really felt like kind of this Southern California transplant, but I think since then my work has shifted because of the influences of living here. But I also think art in the Northwest has shifted because of this, you know, reaction to sort of this growing city, and sort of maybe that is a bit of, you know, influences, more global influences, more national influences, more regional influences. But I definitely see a lot more of what I would consider to be Northwest artists who are my peers and contemporaries that kind of fall into this category that I do, kind of with either these themes or my aesthetic. I'm definitely feeling, yeah, like maybe I've shifted a little bit toward the to sort of what fits within the Northwest, but also the Northwest has shifted a little bit to meet me. I mean, not to meet me, but, you know, in a way where there's more artists dealing with these topics and seeing these kind of color schemes and aesthetics emerge, and each artist does it in a unique way. But that also makes me feel like I'm in conversation with other contemporary artists who are seeing and feeling these trends that I am and that I'm focusing on. And I'm seeing other artists grappling with similar things. And so, yeah, it also goes back to this idea of sort of like, you know, a contemporary history painter capturing this moment. And I'm seeing other artists kind of coming up with an aesthetic language that I think, you know, is very much in conversation with mine. And that makes me feel, you know, also that I'm maybe onto something. Maybe, who knows? We'll look back, you know, many years from now and say, oh yeah, that looks like that moment, or maybe we won't. But it does make me feel like, yes, there is something about this that is true to the here and now.
Yeah, and the thing that's really wonderful is that so many people feel adversarial to the built environments that take over nature, but you maintain your sense of optimism about the interplay between the two. And that's,
Yeah.
I think, which makes your art very attractive. You know, the colors, there's a joy, there's expansion, but seeing how they can coexist in ways that are just, they may not be natural.
Yes.
But that they're
still beautiful.
At all. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, that goes to something I haven't mentioned yet, that really it's not about judgment, it's about thoughtfulness, it's about consideration, it's about, if we realize how we interact with our environment and how we build our environment, then we get to make more intentional decisions about it. And so it is an optimistic view, I think. And part of that is because I recognize, as an artist, I am a creator. I create things, right? I create environments. And as human beings, we are builders. We don't just build things because it's utilitarian. There's much more to that, you know, that's like in our nature. And I think that's a very beautiful thing. And then it can also be a very negative thing sometimes. You know, we create all these products and things, and and we're seeing the impacts of that. So you know, I am torn sometimes, because I am spending a lot of time researching sort of human impact on the environment and on each other. But then I also think, you know, it's kind of, it goes both ways, right? We can also use that human nature to do things that are really beautiful and extraordinary. And so I think, yeah, my work is more about being intentional about what we do. And it's not in judgment of what people do, but yeah, more about, yeah, trying to find that balance between being aware and being critical, but being optimistic and wanting to be beautiful and positive at the same time.
Right. That's lovely. That's wonderful. Somebody asked, what was the artist of the first slide? The grand.
Oh,
thing?
yes. Let me, that was a super famous one, and that was Bierstadt.
Bierstadt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I love too, at the Seattle Art Museum, when you go into sort of the historical wing, one of the first walls you see is this gorgeous sort of Hudson River School painting. I can't remember which artist it is, but it might be Bierstadt actually. He's one of the very famous ones. And I think that was also this idea of the sublime from that time where nature was like this sublime force. And when I started studying global studies, to me, that felt like the new sublime. That globalization is this sort of, macro force of everything. And then that goes back to that kind of like macro, micro, like these urban niches, but also that speaking to this sort of phenomenon that's not in any one person's control. It's you know, this is a train that has left the station.
Right.
At full speed.
Somebody else asked if you were in the conservatory at Volunteer Park. I'm assuming they're asking if you showed there.
If I've showed at the Volunteer Park Conservatory, not the Volunteer Park one, but the Tacoma Conservatory. I've done several installation shows there, and I have images of that on my website. And again, doing the artwork, my installation art is sometimes in urban environments and sometimes in nature environments. And I've done for years now some shows in conservatories. And it took me a long time to make the connection to painting conservatories, actually. That just dawned on me. I've worked in conservatories, but it wasn't until just last year that I started painting them. But there's something really beautiful about putting those installations in a conservatory as if they are actual plants or living organisms, and it looks really interesting to me, that juxtaposition of these sort of, you know, sometimes tropical vegetation and then my like kind of bright quasi plant like installations.
Right. It's interesting. I was in Palm Springs right before in February, so that was my last normal moment. But they had this really sort of kitschy conservatory of cacti species that had been around. This conservatory must have been around forever, because the cacti were trying to escape out to like the roof through this thing. It was like so old that they were trying to
bust out. Well, one day, hopefully sometime soon, I'd love to go see that. I did in my last visit to LA, the one that when I went to LA to do photo research for my show, I went to the Huntington Gardens and just took a ton of photos. So now as I'm starting to do more paintings of sort of more nature dominated landscape, there always has to be a little architectural detail in there, but my newest paintings that are still in process are almost entirely nature painting, but painted in the same aesthetic as sort of these urban spaces, and just kind of exploring like how does that, you know, I'm still trying to see what the outcome of that decision is in terms of representing my ideas and my concepts and how people perceive them and react to them, if all this information will still translate. But I'm really enjoying painting them. But again, the Huntington Garden is gorgeous, but each space is so curated and so lovely. And so in these paintings, I'm letting the little labels kind of remain. So it's like, oh, it's nature, and then there's this little label for the cactus, and you know, so it kind of is a clue that gives away that it's this very curated space.
It's a very gentile kind of space, you know. Old world gardeners.
Yes, absolutely.
With the rules of the way the garden is supposed to be laid out, and it's very beautiful, but very
contrived.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Does anyone else have any questions before we close with Elizabeth? This has been so wonderful. Oh my God, we're going to have to talk afterwards. So many more questions.
Well, and also anyone feel free to email me if you'd like. I have an email on my website that you can submit emails, and so I'm more than happy to answer any additional questions.
Do you use oil-based pens?
I do. They're called Art Deco pens, and I've been using them for years, and they are by far my favorite. And I just find that they work the best, but it is some sort of oil-based pen, paint pen. So when I, in my materials, when I say acrylic and oil, the acrylic really refers to the background and most of the painting and the gel. And then the oil refers to the paint pens, but also in my newer, last few years, I've also been using this sort of oil-based enamel. It's not really oil paint, it's Prismacolor, and it's actually, and now that I'm addicted to it, it's really hard to find, and Blick doesn't carry as many colors as they used to, and I wish I had like bought out the store 6 months ago, but they're really interesting. I think that they were more craft based, and then a few years ago they did a big push, the company did a big push to kind of ebb into more fine art, and I happened to discover it at that moment and find really wonderful ways of using it, because it doesn't mix like paint. It kind of creates marbly surfaces, and some of them are glittery and some of them are shiny, and so yeah, it just really speaks to my aesthetic. So those are also oil based, but not like traditional oil paints.
Okay. Okay, terrific. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for all the amazing questions and feedback. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Elizabeth.